2021. On behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to thank you so much for your participation.
So I cannot hear anything. Oh, your microphone is muted, Miss Hương Trần and Miss Ha. So we cannot hear anything. Yeah.
Miss Ha, please, can you introduce again? Because maybe the system mute all of our microphone.
Yeah. I don't know. Could you please introduce us so that we can start our session?
Okay, so I will introduce.
Okay,
yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So good morning, our presenters and participants. Welcome to the virtual TIENG International Conference 2021. On behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to thank you so much for your participation and contribution to this annual convention success. And as the moderator, we are delighted to see all of you in light of the virtual presence today, especially in this parallel live oral presentation. And we hope that all of you will be able to have some valuable knowledge and experience as takeaway after the talk. In case you have any questions or concerns about the presentation, please feel free to leave them in the chat box so that we can gather the questions at the Q&A session at the end of this presentation. So please welcome first Ms. Cao Hồng Phuong from Hanoi National University of Education and Associate Professor Jonathan Newton from Victoria University of Wellington with the presentation entitled Using Textbook Series TIENG ANH 10, 11, 12 More Effectively, Tips from Task-Based Learning. Now, please, Ms. Cao Hồng Phuong and Associate Professor Jonathan Wellington.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, for your introduction. So Professor Jonathan and I will present our project on using the textbook series Tiếng Anh 11, 12 more effectively, tips from task-based language teaching and learning. Our talk covers 5 main parts. First, reasons why we decided to evaluate this textbook. Second, the aims of our project. Next, what is TBLT? Fourth, some major findings. And finally, we will provide some tips for a better textbook use. Why is the evaluation needed? As we all know, to improve the quality of ELT in Vietnam, the government launched a curriculum reform in 2006. In the curriculum guidelines, TBLT is included, and also textbooks are designed to realize the curriculum. We all know that a lot of money and effort by the government invested in designing this textbook series, which is currently used nationwide for high school students. And teachers in Vietnam normally relied on textbooks. But research has shown that TBLT is not well understood or implemented in Vietnam. Teachers are often not familiar with TBLT, and they feel uncomfortable with communicative activities in the textbook. Thus, they often skip these activities and go back to their form-focused teaching style. And as a consequence, this undermines the communicativeness of the textbook. Therefore, our project aims to help teachers to use the textbook more effectively and thus to enrich communicative learning opportunities of the learners. To achieve this aim, we have done 2 steps. First, we analyzed the textbook from a TBLT perspective. And secondly, from our findings, we will propose some tips to help teachers to use the textbook better. What we did, we looked at TBLT principles to analyze the textbook structure and activity sequencing. We also look at task features to analyze type of activities to see how they align with task features. And in the scope of this talk, we just focus on type of activities. And Professor Jonathan Newton will talk about TBLT and why TBLT and task features. Over to you, Professor Jonathan Newton.
I could just move over there. Hi, folks. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to address the question of why TBLT. Why should teachers worry about this, be interested in this particular approach to language teaching and learning? It's a tough question. You know, the problem is that language learning has been introduced into formal education, and in formal education we tend to focus on accruing knowledge. But language learning is not like accruing knowledge. Language learning is a sense-making process. Language learning is a process which involves learners using the language to learn the language. But in a traditional classroom, we learn the language in a decontextualized form with the assumption that at the end of the learning process, we can then use it. TBLT turns that around and says, actually, get the learners using the language early in the process. And this is because, according to many scholars in the field, actual language use is a primary shaper of linguistic form and the foundation for language learning. Just think about that. Using the language in genuine ways to try and express meanings or discover meanings, to understand something. Similar idea from the same source. A first usage-based tenet is that language and language learning are meaning-based. Now, you know that's true, of course, from your use of your first language. You know, the language is a tool that we use for making sense of the world. And we're in danger in the classroom of treating language as something other than a tool for meaning making. We're in danger of treating it as some kind of strange system which you have to learn like a set of rules. Now, rules are important and forms are important. We have to learn words and so forth, but we can do that much more effectively if we involve the learners in a lot of meaning-focused study. So that's why many people think that TBLT has an important contribution to make to language education. So what is a task then? You know, what distinguishes a task in your textbook from an exercise or something else that you do? Well, tasks are learning activities which require learners to use the language, right? That idea of use being central, with an emphasis on meaning, and importantly, to do something, to attain an objective. Yeah. So we're going to look a bit more. We'll give you examples. In fact, I think right now we're going to give you a couple of examples of what we mean. Let's just focus in a bit more on what a task is. According to Alice, and I think this is a really useful definition, a task has 4 key features. Now you're starting to see this theme come up, aren't you? Meaning, meaning, meaning. The primary focus is on communicating meaning or understanding meaning if you're reading or listening. So it's not only speaking and writing. There's some kind of gap in knowledge that makes you want to communicate or to understand. And learners are not just parrots or robots. They're trying to use the language they know to make sense of the world. And the task has some kind of outcome other than the use of language. So it's not just like an exercise where you match words with definitions. There's no outcome there. That's just simply a language learning activity. It might be valuable, but it's not a task. Now, we can think of these 4 features in terms of an acronym, MAGOO. So this is just for you as a teacher. If you're a teacher, think of MAGOO: meaning, gap, own resources, and outcome. Okay, Magoo, and we're going to draw on Magoo through this session. All right, meaning, gap, own resources, outcome. Now let's have a look at an example from the textbook. This is a project where the learners have to do a survey to find out about family life and the different families represented in the classroom, right? So they go around and they ask different classmates these questions, they get the data, they bring it together in groups, and they prepare to report on what they've found out. Now, how about we do the Magoo analysis here? Is the focus on meaning? Sure. Is there a gap? Loads of gaps. I don't know things about all the families in the room. And I don't know what information my partner from my group is going to bring and find out and bring back to our group so we can build our report. And then at the end down here, I don't know what other groups are going to report either. So there's lots of gaps. Are learners drawing on their own resources? Absolutely. They're having to go out and make sense of the information. Remember I talked about sense making? Can you see here that learners are sense making? They're using language to learn language. Is there an outcome? Well, look down here. Compare your findings and report to the class. Yes, you're doing this to report to the class. So this is a really nice example of task-based language teaching. And in your textbook, it's called a project. So there we have a clear example of a task. Here's an example. Maybe not such a strong task. Let's have a look. Is there a focus on meaning? You've got to look at the chart and decide what the differences are in the roles and family life roles. You've got to listen to somebody talking about the roles of men and women and decide whether the sentences here are true or false, etc. So there's quite a strong focus on meaning, right? That's great. Is there a gap? Yeah, you don't really know what the information is, so you've got to listen and decide. Learners have to draw on their own resources to make sense of things, so that's great. But there's no real outcome. What's the outcome? How many did I get true? How many did I get false? That's not really interesting. There's no sort of, why am I doing this? So I think that's an area where there's a bit of a gap. And I think this is where so that's what we call a task-like activity. It contains some of the features of tasks, but not all of them. So it's not actually a task. And our talk today is going to help you show you how to make these kind of activities into stronger tasks. Okay, over to Ms. Phuong.
Thanks, Professor Jonathan. So the first aim, how well do the textbook activities align with TBLT? The data tell us that 21% of the activities belong to task. 33% of the activities are task-like activities. What does it mean? It means that there are a lot of potential to make the task-like activities become stronger. And 46% of the activities are non-task, just exercises. So one interesting finding we have is the majority of task-like activities lack of clear communicative outcomes, which is a very important feature of task that Professor Jonathan Newton just mentioned earlier. Having a closer look at the distribution of activities, we see that the final section of the textbook, which is a project section, aligns very well with TBLT. As you can see, it is the blue color, the color of hope. Okay, so let's have a look at the example of the project that Professor Jonathan Newton just mentioned. We see that it addresses all Magoo features. Okay, especially it has a very clear outcome, which is compare your findings and get ready to report to the class. Still know what they have to do at the end of the activities. The second insight is that tasks or task-like activities are present in all sections, as we can see in the brown and the blue colors in all getting started, language skills, communication and culture, looking back, and project. So what do they tell us? The task-like activities can be strengthened with reference to task features. That is, the next part of our talk will be about. Okay, over to you, Professor.
Hello again. Okay, so what have we shown you so far? Well, you've got textbooks that have got some tasks and some activities that have got quite a few features of tasks and some activities that are not tasks. And as Phuong said, our focus is on the, I've got a bit of a chord mix up here. Let me just fix that up. Our focus is on the orange, on those activities in the textbook that are like tasks, but are not quite tasks. So we're going to talk with you about how to strengthen those. And there are 3 steps we're going to focus on here. The first step is to analyze as a teacher. What you can do is look at the activities using the Magoo features to identify tasks and task-like activities. Then when you find a task-like activity, make simple changes to strengthen it using the Magoo features. So if there's no gap, look for ways to create an information gap and so forth. And then third, try out the activities in class, paying attention to what impact it has when you actually strengthen the activities and make them more task-like. Because all teachers need to be looking for evidence of their impact on learning. So if you make a change, if you try something out, observe its impact. So those are the 3 steps: analyze, adapt, try it out, and observe. All right, now down to the practical stuff for those of you who might be finding this a bit abstract. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty, as we call it, the practical way to do this. So I'm going to talk through 3 examples of how you can adapt task-like activities. Okay, here's another activity. We've already looked at this, haven't we? We saw, didn't we, that this activity is quite meaning focused. There's really good listening activities where you've got to listen and understand the meaning, right? It's not form focused. It's really focused on what is the meaning that is being conveyed. That's great. There's a kind of a gap, you know, because you don't know whether these statements are true or false, and you only fill the gap by listening. And also up in activity number 1. There's kind of a gap between what do I notice about this table and what do you notice? Do we notice the same thing, right? So there's a gap there which makes us want to communicate. So that's great. And we have to use our own resources to do this. But as we pointed out earlier, there's no kind of there's no outcome of any notable sense. So how to strengthen it? Well, here's a couple of suggestions. The first one is, you notice up in activity 1, it just says discuss the changes, right? It's kind of vague. So my suggestion would be, okay, identify 3 changes and why they happened. So you've got to, each person looks quietly at the chart. What are the 3 things I noticed in the changes between 1976 and 2012? Well, you know, the amount of housework that women did dropped a lot. The amount of housework that men did climbed a little bit, not too much. And then perhaps compare what you think about the table or the chart with a partner. And then prepare to share with the class what you think is an important feature. So the teacher can just choose 1 or 2 or 3 people to do that. All right. And you can see what we've done there is we've given the learners a more focused outcome of the activity. Now let's look at activity 2, where they listen and then decide whether these statements are true or false. A very simple way to improve this is to get the learners to look at the true false sentences before they listen and make guesses, right? So if the learners have to look at each of these sentences, do I think this is true or false? I don't know. I'm going to make a guess that men and women's roles in the family have become similar. I'm going to say, no, that's false because my dad never does any housework, right? So that's false. And then I'm going to listen, and that's going to give my listening a lot more, I'm going to be much more engaged in listening because now I have a position to listen from. I'm no longer a robot. I'm no longer passive. I'm now an active listener who has engaged in thinking, in sense making, which is the phrase I want you to really sort of take home from this. And the note I want you to also think about here is that when we get learners to express an opinion or share personal experience, or make a prediction before they do a reading activity or a listening activity, and then they can check it at the end, this strengthens the communicativeness. This strengthens the notion that they are listening or reading for a purpose. Because the worst thing we want, and this is going to, this just destroys learners' motivation. If they're just told to read and answer a bunch of questions, why am I reading? It just becomes a kind of a empty, vacuous activity. So we can strengthen engagement through these ideas. Let's look at another activity. I'm sorry if you're not familiar with the textbook. Let me just quickly go over this. It's more about housework. So here we are. The students have to read this text here, and they have to decide which of the three headings is the best heading for the passage that they have to read. They have to read again, and they have to kind of go through some vocabulary. And then at the end, they have to answer the question, what benefits do you get from housework? Okay, let's look at this. Meaning? Yeah, sure. There's lots of focus on meaning. There's a bit of vocab work, but mostly there's good focus on meaning. There's kind of a gap here because I have to read the passage to decide which heading is the best. I have to draw my own resources to understand the text and to choose the heading and also to answer the question at the end. Outcome? I'm not sure if I was a learner that I would really know why I'm doing that, right? I think that, again, is quite weak in this example. And this is something that a teacher can really strengthen without doing too much extra work. So as a teacher, how are you going to strengthen this activity by strengthening the outcome? Well, look down at the final activity. What benefits do you get when, what benefits do family members get from sharing housework? Now, how about we put that at the top? How about we start the lesson with the question? What benefits do you get from sharing housework? Everybody, you've got 2 minutes to brainstorm. You can use your first language or your second language. I don't care, because this is sense making. You're generating engagement. Then quickly check your notes with a partner. You've now engaged the learner in the big question that the whole lesson is focused on, which is the benefits of housework. And then when the learners get to the end of the lesson, now go back to your first answer to that question. And now you've read through the text and done the lesson. How many of your ideas at the beginning are covered in the text?
Hey,
What
Jonathan,
benefits?
I just want to remind you we have about 2 more minutes for
Yep,
the presentation and 5 minutes for Q&A section.
Yep, we're good. Thank you. So how many of your ideas were covered in the lesson, and what benefits surprised you most? Write or tell a partner. Okay, so you're engaging learners in owning the content that they're living with and working with in the activity. One more very quick one. Okay, housework, more housework. Learners have to decide on what they like and don't like about housework. And then at the end, they've got to do a report to the class about their activity. So yes, it's meaning focused. There's a gap, there's an outcome. Own resources is an outcome, but it's not a very strong one. What's wrong with this outcome down here? Report your findings to the class. It's kind of vague. So again, the outcome is the problem in these activities. We can strengthen it. Here's an alternative. Prepare to tell the class or another group, if you've got lots of little groups, about something from your conversation about housework, and you can make it up. So you can tell the class a lie or the truth. In other words, you could say to the class, me and my partner both really love doing the laundry, and the class have to guess whether it's true or false. So in this case, we've strengthened the outcome and we've made it more focused. All right, summing up the key points in my last minute and a half, our last minute and a half. Sorry, I had to rush through the last bit. Strengthening the communicative outcome can be done with quite simple changes, and I've given you some examples there. Of course, if you're trying this out in the classroom, you're going to make mistakes and it won't always work out. And I think you have to accept that, but don't give up. I like to think of mistakes as falling forwards. You trip over, but you're still moving forwards. I like this diagram. Some people think of success like this, but I think the reality, especially as teachers, is this. So you have to go through here, the round and round process to get up to here. All right, so keep trying. Effective teachers are innovators, not robots. The point we're trying to make here, I think our most important point, is that you need to treat the textbook as a starting point for effective teaching and make good principled decisions about how you use it. It's not a Bible, yeah. Are you familiar with KISS as an acronym? Keep it simple, stupid is what it means. Keep it simple, stupid. It means don't get too complicated. 2 more points. I think there are times when you can allow the learners to use their first language to strengthen the sense making. Not to replace English, but just to strengthen their engagement in the activity. And that's a topic we could engage with at another time. And our final point is we're encouraging teachers to take task-like activities and strengthen them by using the Magoo features. But not everything has to be a task. Within task-based language teaching, there's strong encouragement, of course, to focus on language forms, to do pronunciation practice, vocab practice, and grammar. The point is that those form-focused activities have to fit into an overall usage-based communicative approach. That was probably a little bit too much information too fast, but we had to get to our deadline for time, and we're pretty much there. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to hand back over to the moderator. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Cao Phuong and Jonathan Newton for such an informative and practical presentation. I think so. Now it's time for the Q&A session, and I have received 3 questions in the chat box and also in the website, but maybe they are for the same problem. And I will read one of these questions. Could you mind giving some specific solutions to the problems that many teachers skip activity in the textbook because of the time limit in 45 minutes of teaching every paragraph?
I'm sorry, I missed some of what you were saying there, but I'm just going to respond to the question in the chat. Is this what you're talking about, the time pressure? Yeah. So this is another of my PhD students, Hao Dao, has done some research on textbook use in a Vietnamese university. She found that the teachers under time pressure, they dropped all of the tasks and task-like activities, and they just focused on the language form-focused exercises. So under time pressure, what teachers tend to do if they're not careful is they reduce the richness of the textbook and just take out the bits that are easy to do. Now, I understand the constraints teachers are under, but I think the danger is that in being so concerned about time that you lose the richness of language learning. I think you construct, for example, I think a lot of the form-focused activities could take place outside of the class. Learners can do them by themselves. What learners cannot do by themselves is communicate with each other. And that's where the classroom can be an important place. Will you intervene, and how if student task performance is ridden with language errors? That's a really great point. I think the task-based approach is more tolerant of errors at the beginning because the mistakes reveal learnable opportunities. So if the learners are making mistakes when they're trying to express themselves, those mistakes then become the focus of the post-task phase. The other approach, which is to avoid errors, is for the teacher to teach lots of grammar to begin with, which is kind of maybe going to suit 5 learners in a class, but 10 of the learners might know the grammar, 10 of the other learners might not care less, and it's a big waste of time in many cases. So I think form-focused teaching of grammar can be a real problem. But in a task-based approach, you certainly focus on grammar, but you do it during the process and through feedback in particular, and then in the post-task phase. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, there is one more question on the chat box. That say, could you give out some advice if teachers are supposed to follow the textbook strictly?
Well, everything we've said has involved the teachers following the textbook, but actually enriching it, not taking away from it, actually enriching it. Phuong, do you want to say something about that?
Address the question you asked, could you please give some advice if teachers are supposed